Scientific methods are the only thing we can agree on as being the best possible explanation for everything, right? Well, maybe not, because physicist Brian Miller reckons he has evidence for intelligent design. And so I just don't know what to believe anymore. Hello, I'm the Skeptic, the British floating circle that watches people make extraordinary claims and then I explain why I don't accept what they're saying. Christopher Cernake hosts a show on Christ Jesus Ministries, and his channel is definitely one that throws money at a professional look, which may or may not be a way into tricking an audience into believing credibility. He must know what he's talking about. Look at all his fancy equipment. Though he does have the sound of a pro, he gets on some out-there guests to try and use science to prove a god. Yeah, sure. However, before a creator on YouTube uses physics to change everything, if this isn't your first Skeptic video, hit the like, the subscribe and the bell to get more videos like this in your feed. And a super thanks to those that hit super thanks in some recent videos. Lisa Boban, Kinko Kitsumi, Emerald Spark, Lily, Skill Dude, Roger Wenzel and Godless Granny. Lisa the Rainbow Giraffe bestows leaves upon you all. More hen. Hit me with science, since I struggle with it at the best of times.
Today we're going to start off by looking at a quotation from a piece in the Marshall News Messenger by Dr. Jerry Hopkins, a retired professor, columnist, and a historian. Dr. Hopkins quotes reads as follows. Several eminent thinkers, philosophers, and scientists have come to question Darwinism and even evolution as a viable theory regarding the origins of living creatures.
Well, duh! Evolution isn't abiogenesis. They're two completely different things. One is about gradual changes, and the other one is about the emergence of life. What the is Darwinism? When did that become a religion?
The basic elements of humanity, morals, ethics, thinking, religion, cannot find reasonable explanation in the totally materialistic theory of Darwin with its insistence on random chance, material processes. Dr. Miller, what do you think of this quote from Dr. Hopkins, and may you please expand upon these ideas?
Yeah, certainly. And when people use the word Darwinism, that's obviously referring to Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection and adaptation. And that's been sort of the standard theory for multiple decades. But what's happened is top-level theorists, evolutionary theorists, have come to recognize that it can't actually explain the large-scale transformations in life.
Now, I'm not an evolutionary biologist or whatever, but there's no need to explain big changes, right? Because the little ones are things that you can literally see, and they add up to the big ones over huge amounts of time. Who is this guy? Do we have another creationist with a self-given doctorate here? Oh, apparently not. Well then.
So for instance, there was a 2016 meeting at the Royal Society in London on new trends in evolutionary biology. And one of the leading theorists was Gert Muller. And in his opening talk, he talked about how the standard evolutionary model, neo-Darwinism, is really helpful if you're looking at things like finch beaks getting smaller or larger. But if you're trying to explain how, let's say, a fish became an amphibian or how a bacteria became a complex organism, it is hopelessly inadequate.
But surely there's an issue with the questioning. A fish didn't become an amphibian. There was a common ancestor with creatures that ended up living very differently in environments they became suitable for.
And during the series of sessions in London, there were many attempts to try to explain how some other sub-theory might fill the explanatory gaps. But nobody presented a single piece of evidence that any other idea could explain these large-scale transformations in nature. So currently, there's a recognition that the neo-Darwinian model cannot explain the large-scale transformations in life, and there really is nothing to replace it. That's the sort of situation we have today.
Did someone have a poop burger for dinner? Because I smell bullshit. Lots of tiny changes over hundreds of thousands and even millions of years add up to big changes eventually. And I know that's an oversimplification, but I'm not a trained professional.
Thank you for covering that quotation, Dr. Miller. And as Dr. Hopkins mentioned, there are more scientists questioning whether or not evolutionary materialistic ideas can explain the origin of living creatures via material processes.
Well, it's a different question. Evolution isn't there to explain the origin of life. It's a mechanism that explains the diversity of life.
And that's why we're going to be covering both the physics behind the origin of life and the universe.
Just like a creationist to think that evolution has something to do with the origin of the universe.
Speaking of which, Dr. Miller, as an expert in thermodynamics, what do you think of this quotation from Dr. Sarfati? He states, "If the total amount of mass energy is limited and the amount of usable energy is decreasing, then the universe cannot have existed forever. Otherwise, it would have already have exhausted all usable energy, the heat death of the universe." Dr. Miller, including thermodynamics, what evidence from physics do we have that suggests that our universe had a beginning?
Yeah, and that's a classic issue that people that study cosmology or our universe have recognized. Because what happened is when Einstein's theory of general relativity became accepted, it implied that our universe had a beginning. And this was really disturbing because if our universe began, that means that something outside of time and space had to begin it.
Oh, this old thing. If something is outside of time and space, it can't interact with it because if it did, it would be within time and space. And who's to say that universes don't just collapse in on themselves all the time, and once all that condensed everything is clumped together into a tiny point, the new heat buildup causes it to explode outwards again. You don't need anything outside of all this for that to happen, right?
Which had very deep theological implications. Many scientists were very concerned about this, people like Fred Hoyle. So he and others tried to get around this problem by coming up with different models of the universe. So he came up with sort of the steady state model. Others came up with an oscillating model where universes would expand and then contract and bounce and expand. But that quote, as you read, deals with a serious problem. And that's, as time goes on, our universe is running out of energy that would be useful for things like igniting stars or for driving photosynthesis. So what's going to happen eventually is our universe is going to become just this cold, dead state of a very diffuse soup of photons and other particles in space. All the stars will be gone and everything will just be inert. Well, that means if you go back in time, you have to imagine that there's more and more useful free energy. And in fact, also lower and lower entropy. So if you go back in time, that means there had to be a beginning because your entropy can only go so small. So that's very much the evidence is pointing to a beginning.
Which a bounce would appear to be. And obviously, I'm no scientist, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but at least there are explanations that don't require the hand of something that can't ever be demonstrated to exist.
So, Dr. Miller, I'm hearing you say that the scientific evidence is pointing inexorably to the fact that the universe had a beginning.
Can we call it a point at which it was rather than a beginning? Language is important there, Mr. Hostman.
And on that note, not all physicists or scientists would agree that the universe had a beginning. In episode 7 of the Discovery Institute's Psiing Uprising series, you covered several of these models, like the oscillating universe idea that was popularized by Carl Sagan. Dr. Miller, in your view, what evidence leads you to the conclusion that a universal beginning is best understood in light of the theory of intelligent design rather than competing purely naturalistic or materialistic theories?
Yeah, so what you find is that if you look at the evidence that's clear, that's well established, it all points to this idea that the universe had a beginning. Time, space, matter, and energy all began. And that strongly points to the idea that there is a creator outside of time and space that started everything.
No, it doesn't. It just points to a moment that the universe came to be. It comes to something when this dum-dum actually feels smart, especially next to a scientist. Great. There's evidence that there was a point in time that we can go, oh, here's our universe. Nothing about that says made by a third party. That's some major gap filling that might not really even be a gap.
But people try to get around this problem. And a classic example is like Paul Steinhardt, who originally developed what's called inflationary cosmology, but later rejected it. And he came with a more modern version of the oscillating universe. And that's the idea. His idea is basically the universe expands, it then stops, it contracts. It doesn't go all the way back to a singularity type event, but then it contracts a little bit, but then expands a lot more. So the universe is always getting larger and larger. And he attempted to argue that this oscillating model did not need a beginning. Well, the problem is you have people like from the University of Buffalo who published an article in the Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics Will Kinney and Nina Sein. And what they argued is that the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem actually does apply to Steinhardt's model. Now, the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is this theorem developed by some very famous astrophysicists, cosmologists, and it shows that any universe on average which is expanding must have had a beginning. And his model falls in that category.
Isn't that what science is? Some people suggest an idea, they find a way to test it, and then they show others how to test it, and everyone shows their results. Just because we haven't made universes ourselves doesn't mean we're not going to, or even going to observe universes making themselves. But to say that a being did it without demonstrating the being is silly. It could have been any being that did it, like, Lisa the rainbow giraffe, leaf be upon her.
Now, another attempt to get around the beginning is by Roger Penrose. And Roger Penrose is, again, a legendary cosmologist and physicist. And he talked about the fact that our universe started in a remarkably low entropy state. And he's the one that came up with that amazing calculation that the chance of the universe being in such a low entropy state is like 1/10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. But he came up with a more recent model called basically a conformal cyclical cosmology model, where he tried to argue that what happens is that the universe expands, and then as it starts to run out of free energy, a crossover event takes place, and then it starts to basically start over as a new Big Bang event. And what happens is his model also faces serious problems.
I guess all the models face some kind of problem here or there, but you don't get to say Magic Skyman did it.
Because he has to assume certain laws of physics that don't make sense. For instance, he has to assume that electrons lose their mass at the end of the universe, which doesn't really match with particle physics. He also has to assume that there's this phantom field, and it has no physical reality. It's just a mathematical element until this crossover event, where suddenly it becomes a real field, which grows in mass and then sort of drives a new Big Bang event and starts things off again, or stops expansion in his case. And what happens with all these models is, to avoid the beginning, they have to create all these ad hoc assumptions, which are not supported by evidence.
Whoa. All these assumptions? You mean like assuming a god is outside of time and space to do it?
And they have to invoke incredible levels of fine-tuning for their mechanisms actually to work. So again, their attempts to get rid of a beginning to avoid a creator simply forces them to apply enormous levels of fine-tuning, which again points to a creator.
Oh, my giraffe. No, it doesn't. It just means that maybe they've not got it 100% right. Or maybe they have and you don't accept it because it'll hurt the feelings of the god you've made up.
So it doesn't really avoid the problem. And the last attempt is by Sean Carroll. And what he argued is that you have kind of a singularity event, and then it expands forward and backward in time, so that the universe is actually growing infinitely large in the infinite past. And the problem with that model is he has to assume essentially infinite amounts of fine-tuning to contract into this very special Big Bang type event and then expand again. So in every attempt to avoid the beginning, people have to propose ideas that are not supported by any evidence.
Just like the proposition that there's a creator which isn't supported by any evidence. You're just saying their ideas are silly, but mine aren't. Even though you're doing exactly the same thing. Though yours adds in a supernatural element and the others are trying to use demonstrable natural explanations because, natural is demonstrable.
They're kind of ad hoc assumptions. And they have to impose enormous levels of fine-tuning in these models, so that they have to be very carefully designed to avoid the beginning. But again, that just points to a creator.
How? Just because you're a scientist and have some diagrams in the background that I have no idea what the meaning is behind them, you don't get to act like the creator route is the winning explanation. The absence of evidence for one thing doesn't equal evidence for something else. Prove your creator.
So in order to avoid the beginning, the evidence of a creator in a beginning, they have to appeal to a creator in a practical sense to explain the fine-tuning that makes their models work. So in other words, the details of their models have to be perfectly set for them to work to avoid a beginning.
Dr. Miller, in other words, it sounds like a universal beginning is best understood in the parameters of the intelligent design theory. Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists, said something similar when he said that the anthropic principle is the best argument for intelligent design. Hitchens stated, "At some point, certainly, we are all asked which is the best argument you've come up against from the other side. And by other side, he means the idea advocates. I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
Context, though. It's all about context. I've not heard Hitchens say that, but with a little British sarcasm, you can make it sound like it's the most intriguing when in fact it's the least. But also, the line is, which argument is the best? He just said it's intriguing, which might mean that he finds it funny that people suggest it.
Dr. Miller, can you please explain what the anthropic principle is and if it is evidence for the theory of intelligent design?
Why does he look like he's really impressed by a poo he had here? Sorry, I had to point that out. Please, explain it for us slow folk.
Yeah, the anthropic principle, the term was coined by a person named Brandon Carter, who was a physicist, and he described what was called the weak anthropic principle. And it's pretty straightforward. It simply says that our universe had to have the conditions that would allow for life. And that's somewhat of a truism because we're here, therefore the conditions had to be right for us to be here.
But that's not universal. Otherwise, there'd be abundant life in the universe, right? This is just a localized coincidence. Just in our 8-planet solar system, there are only 2 planets with populations that we know about, the carbon-based life on Earth and the robots on Mars. That's not abundant. That's only, 1.5 out of 8.
So that's pretty straightforward. But then there's others, the people like Frank Tipler, who came up with more of a strong anthropic principle. And that's the idea that the universe must have had the right conditions for an intelligent carbon-based organism to emerge. So this deals more with teleology or purpose, that there's something about our universe that seems to have been designed for the purpose of supporting life. That's the basic idea.
Which is also dumb because 99.99999 reoccurring percent of the universe, at least that we know about, isn't able to sustain our life. So if it's been designed, there's a massive flaw in it.
And what's also really important is that strongly points to design. And here's why. If you imagined that you had a machine and this machine could generate universes, it has lots and lots of dials. So you can control the universe you create. So you can turn one dial and gravity is stronger, another dial, gravity is weaker, another dial, the electromagnetic force that holds electrons and protons together is stronger or weaker. Another dial controls the entropy of the early universe and so forth. That many of these dials have to be very carefully set for a universe that supports life. So for instance, if the force that holds electrons and protons together were just a few percent larger or smaller, or the force that holds the nucleus together was a few percent larger or smaller, there wouldn't be enough carbon or oxygen in the universe to support life.
Is he making the puddle analogy slightly different?
Other dials are much more extreme. So in case of gravity, if you imagine the reasonable range you'd expect gravity could have been to allow for life in the universe is something like 1/10⁵. And that would be like selecting one atom in our entire planet. So again, what you see is clear evidence that a mind designed our universe very carefully with life in mind.
No, maybe you do, but you'd need to prove it.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for covering the anthropic principle. And since we've now seen that the universe is designed for life, we're going to cover the second topic in our interview together. We'll be investigating whether or not there is design in life.
Hang on just a second. We haven't seen any design. We've seen one guy say, it must be design, and another say, well, I believe you, let's continue. But sure, we may as well see what silliness is said for demonstrating life design.
Dr. Miller, on Evolution News, you wrote a brief article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Engineering in Biological Sciences. This article links to your presentation called The Surprising Relevance of Engineering in Biology. Dr. Miller, what is the relevance of engineering in biology, and how does viewing biology from a design perspective increase a fruitful understanding of that field?
Well, it sounds like you're just getting ready to make things confirm your viewpoint if you go in with the mindset that a designer did it.
This is really one of my favorite topics to discuss because it's so significant. Because if you were to talk to any evolutionists or anyone who believes in design over the last several decades, and you ask, what are the different predictions of those two models? Well, evolution predicts, or any blind, undirected process, is that life should often be poorly designed, clumsy, inefficient, suboptimal, or even non-functional. And there's several mathematical models, there's theoretical analyses that all point in this direction. And if you happen to read Stephen Jay Gould, like The Panda's Thumb, or Nathan Lentz's book, Human Errors, you get this basic idea that evolution predicts a lot of what you see in life should be suboptimal, poorly designed because it wasn't planned. There's no planning in advance. It should also look more like what's called the Rube Goldberg machine.
Oh, I love those things, which has nothing to do with the video, I just wanted to say.
But that's what evolution predicts. Because there's no planning, there's no foresight, the idea is you have something that develops by chance, like a protein or a little molecular machine. And then over time, purely by chance, that things kind of come together randomly, they shuffle around, and you get something more complex that wasn't designed in advance, but it may work in a very clumsy way. That's a Rube Goldberg machine. Also, what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective is that it shouldn't look like human engineering, because the idea of evolution is that you have this random search through possibilities, and you eventually stumble across something that does something useful, like propulsion. And the chance of you finding something that looks like human engineering would be pretty minimal. Well, obviously, a design perspective assumes the opposite.
I'm sorry, I kind of zoned out then. When are we getting to the point about humans being demonstrably designed?
We assume that life is optimized, that you see top-down design. And by top-down design, what you mean is that a mind planned the design of an organism in advance. Like if you're going to design a car, in advance, you say, I need an engine, I need a steering system, I need transmission, but everything is designed with this overarching purpose in mind of having a car, for instance.
But you said organism, not a man-made, clearly non-naturally occurring car. Something you can observe being made from scratch, unlike a human people that was blown together from a bit of ground dirt.
And everything is optimized to fit perfectly and symphonically with everything else, because there's a mind that had foresight, it planned in advance. And that's what you see in life, is this picture of top-down design. Also, what happens is you see that many of the design patterns in life are the same design patterns that we use in human engineering.
They're really scraping the barrel here. If something works naturally and a human goes, I'd like to replicate that, it isn't proof that the initial thing was designed. Really, where do they find these folks?
So what you find is all of the assumptions that are driven by evolution have shifted. So biologists, like particularly in the field of systems biologists, have had to abandon very often the evolutionary assumptions and embrace design assumptions.
Give your sources, sir, because it sounds like you're hanging around in the creationist science labs where they throw out all logical reasoning and suggest an undemonstrated being did it. Talk about assumptions, right?
So, for instance, there's like a Professor Balick at Princeton, and he's written very eloquently on how living systems often work at such a high efficiency that it approaches the maximum efficiency possible based on the physics. That would be like sensory systems, that would be things like DNA translation. It's truly amazing. And what's happened is people in the past have always assumed that certain things in life were suboptimal, they're poorly designed, like things like the eye, the appendix, different things like that. But as engineers and more experienced biologists have looked at these systems, they consistently find that they're actually optimized. They're highly optimal design. And the only reason that biologists originally assumed they were poorly designed is they didn't fully understand the biology or principles of engineering.
It's really dishonest to keep saying designed as though it's a fact that stuff has been designed, when in fact, it just sounds like you're trying to take things folks have said about eyes working or not working and making it fit a design narrative. Do we need to bring up the recurrent laryngeal nerve here or no?
And what's happened is these shifting assumptions have really described a revolution taking place in biology. And many people will call it a revolution, even among mainstream biologists, particularly in systems biology. And the reason this revolution is taking place is because what you find is engineers are bringing their expertise to the table in studying living systems. A second advancement is when our ability to study the cell has become more advanced, we're able to see what's happening in greater detail. We're starting to see the complexity of the ingenuity.
But seeing that things are complex doesn't demonstrate anything other than the thing being complex. It takes a massive gap fill to go, well, it's complex, so it must have been created.
The details of the operations. And both the advances in our science and the conversations with engineering have what brought this revolution, where, again, bringing this design perspective to biology is advancing the field dramatically. So when engineers look at life, what they can do is they can see this we use, and then that allows them to make predictions about how this system work and helps them to understand how things work together. And examples of that would be like feedback loops, control systems, four-bar linkages. So again, what you're finding is this design perspective is what's defining the biology of the 21st and 22nd century.
Yeah, I think I'm about to call it quits. There's been absolutely zero evidence of design and just complaints of folks who don't agree with design asserting things, when in fact, that's all that Brian ended up doing. At least in regular old science, there are tests and demonstrations to show the work, and you can see things happening. But with a designer, it's such a lazy approach to say, I see complexity, so it must be a god. If that's how to get a PhD, I could do that right now and say I'm a scientist and I see that Lisa the rainbow giraffe, leaf be upon her, pooped everything into existence because I don't understand some complexity. If you do want to see the rest of the video, I've linked it in the description. But maybe you did see something I missed and there is some evidence for design staring right at me in the face in this video. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I'll skeptic that as a big no. A big thank you to this month's top level ticks on Patreon. Addy Rockart, the Enixes, Elizabeth, Jakari, and the absolute lunatic Travis, as well as all the $3 base ticks. You can become a supporter on Patreon too at patreon.com/theskeptic. The link is in the description, along with links to all my other socials. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. From me, the Skeptic, stay safe, keep thinking logically, and ask questions. Skepticism is the first step towards truth. See you next Saturday.